I don't know how you are, but many times you struggle with God expecting Him to come through in certain specific ways. Some of us might think like mathematicians and say if you can take two numbers, add them up together and come up with a conclusion, it is inescapable. To dodge it, to avoid it, to reinterpret it is just illogical. Why can't God present Himself to us that way? Why can't He come through to us as a mathematician? You take this major premise and the minor premise, and if they are valid in their linkage, the deduction should follow. Why can't God be like that when we are told that He has called us to reason together? And after all, He is the source of all right reasoning. Others of us would say, why can't He be like a lawyer? If you take all of the cumulative evidence together, make the argument, present it to a jury, and they come up with a conclusion beyond any reasonable doubt. Why can't God muster up that kind of a confluence of evidence so that it becomes inescapable for you and for me to make the right deduction? Why can't He be like an artist? You stand on a high mountain peak, look out, and see an absolutely spectacular sunset, and it is indubitable at that moment that this is something beautiful. And therefore, to the artistic mind, if we could just all take a look at the glorious things that He's created and say, there is no other conclusion but that. Why can't He be like that kind of artist? Why can't He be like a scientist? You take this liquid, put it together with that liquid, put it into a test tube, put it over a burner. When it turns green, it becomes obvious what the conclusion is. Give us that kind of empirical data. But you begin to find as life wears on you that the disciplines are too intricate for one single line of reasoning to make that knockdown argument and close the case. It just doesn't work that way. In fact, you learn very quickly in philosophy that one of the flaws of a weak worldview is that it'll only use one single line of argument. No worldview can ever come together just by one single line of argument. There has to be a coalescing, a coming together, a pulling together of much, and the ability to explain that which is to the contrary, so that it becomes very obvious as you and I mature in our lives that there is no one single discipline that has that kind of prerogative to explain all of ultimate reality. That's one side of our predicament. We wish God delivered Himself and presented Himself in one of these ways in some overwhelming fashion. But then there is another one. And for that I borrow from a very simple little illustration. Just a few days ago, I was en route from Atlanta to Toronto, and I got into one of these tiny little planes, a 40-seater type commuter plane. And as I sat down and pulled out my books and started to work, I'd seen a lady go by with two little ones, and she went and sat towards the back. And for some reason, the plane was held up, and one of these children got terrified. And she screamed with that door shut. In fact, it was such a deafening scream that people were actually getting up from close to her and moving away. Finally, I have to say that somewhat frustrated myself, I turned around just to see what was happening. And I was terribly indicted, for I saw her with that little one by her side and her babe in arms, and her head was thrown back, and I just saw tears running down her face. She was helpless. There was nothing she could do to console this other child of hers and tell her it's all right. So I get these two images juxtaposed here. Our demand for certain kind of evidence and argument. And God, when He walked the earth through His Son, looking over His beloved city and saying, how oft would I have gathered you, but you would not. That sense of weeping over a people who refused to come to belief in spite of all that He'd done. He said, if you don't believe who I am, why don't you at least take the evidence of the miracles that I have presented to you? And so my message is to try to pull together another link in this beautiful chain. I have called it, borrowing again from the English, that warning that you hear when you're getting off a train, mind the gap. Mind the gap. Have you ever heard that? You're getting off that train and you're about to step off onto the platform and this voice comes, mind the gap. There's a gap between where you are and where the platform is, and if you don't mind the gap, you're going to get your foot right in the middle of that spot, and that's not where you want to be. There is a gap in our experience and the claim and the calling of God. And with that title, I read for you. Here's the story. Now, that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened here in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see." He said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus acted as if they were going farther, but they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it's nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us as he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" I want to take you through 3 gaps. Gaps that seem to feed the incoherence and then find the bridge that only our blessed Lord can so marvelously fill. It seems like a simple statement, but it's not simplistic. The longer I am in this ministry, the more convinced I am than ever before that outside of the gospel of Jesus Christ, there is no answer to the huge gaps in our lives individually and as a people living in these times. The first gap that I want to talk to you about is when knowledge is not in keeping with reality. When what it is we think we know doesn't align with what we are seeing on the outside. How often this happens. And I present to you at least 3 reasons for that gap. Why it is our knowledge doesn't come alongside and fit together with reality. The first is because of our own finitude. We just have that limitation, and we long to break beyond these barriers. It's sort of the barricades of knowledge we want to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And so we read and we study and we learn and we engage and we interact and we sort out. And we realize even more and more there's so much to be known that we don't know. Was it not Isaac Newton who said something to the effect that even as he got more and more into the years, he just felt like a little boy sitting by the beach just getting his toes wet when there was so much of the ocean of knowledge into which he could never fully submerge himself? People often ask me if I read the dictionary for pleasure, and the answer to that question is yes. I enjoy language. I enjoy words. And I think it is that unique gift of God given to us. And if we don't understand language well, we may lose some of the grand themes because we don't have the means of even capturing an idea. I recall when I was in my graduate studies getting so excited, even though I couldn't afford to buy it then, going to the library to see the new release of the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1974. It had taken 14 years for the production of that massive piece of work, chaired at that time by that great American mind, Mortimer Adler, who, as we know, since came to become a follower of Christ. Mortimer Adler, this Jewish philosopher and brilliant legal mind, headed up this whole committee. And when I was reading all of the statistics, I was fascinated by it. 200 advisors, 300 editors, 4,000 contributors, over 100,000 entries, $34 million, 43 million words. And some editor had the audacity to put this line at the end of it: "This contains the entirety of human knowledge." Can you believe that? Even if it were true, it at least proved that not one of them had it all. Because it took thousands of them. Do you realize, with 43 million words, how that pales by contrast in just one single strand locked into your DNA? Think about it. We have now been told by the recent mappers of the human DNA that there's 2.1 billion bits of information in the human DNA. 2.1 billion bits. From a single fertilized ovum, over 9 months, billions of cells appear, millions of rods and cones, up to 100 trillion cells from a single fertilized ovum. In the single thread of that DNA, do you know there are 600,000 printed pages of information, a library of 1,000 volumes, 50 times the size of that encyclopedia. But this contains the total breadth of human knowledge, that tiny little encyclopedia. Think about it. I remember that wonderful astrophysicist David Bloch. He said, if you take a look at that picture under a telescope there, you're looking at 100 billion stars. He said, if you started counting those stars one per second, you'd be here for 2,500 years. The vastness, so much to know. The finitude of the human mind. We in our ministry love books. Some of our people, like Stuart, have been known to almost faint when they walk into bookstores out of sheer exhilaration. The Jewish motif of the millennium was each man under his own fig tree. If Stuart had written that motif, he would have said each person in his own bookstore. Just the marvelous thrill of knowledge. And what I want to say to you is, God reminds us again and again that our minds are finite. There will always be the gap, and it is important to mind the gap. When we don't, we learn something horrific as a result. December 15th, 1924, one of the most knowledgeable people on war history and war wrote to the Prime Minister of England, and here's what he said: "I do not believe there is the slightest chance of war in our lifetime with Japan. The Japanese people are our allies. The Pacific is dominated by the Westminster Agreement. Japan is at the other end of the world. She cannot menace our vital security in any other way. She has no reason whatever to come into collision with us. War with Japan is not even of the slightest possibility, which any reasonable government need take into account." Page after page after page sustaining that. I remember standing in front of Hiroshima some time ago and Nagasaki, and how sad it was, and how we are reminded again that the finest minds, and there has never been a finer mind in military understanding than Winston Churchill himself, and yet here were his words. I have no doubt that at one point he probably said, "I thought I knew so much, I knew so little. We think we know so much. I'll never forget the day of September 11, when that Secret Service man went and whispered in our president's ear what was happening, and the dismay on his face, knowing what or what not to do, as a children's story was being read in the classroom where he sat. And as he heard of one city being hit, another city being hit, he probably thought to himself, what on earth is happening? Is our country going to implode under all of this? And of course, if bin Laden had had his original proposal, it would have been happening all over this country, somehow by a work of grace that never came to be. We think we know so much, only to find out when we miscalculated how little we know. The first problem is that of finitude. The second gap that we find in thinking we know so much is our propensity to believe certain things. We end up sometimes believing something because that's what we really want to believe. In economics, in our finances, I'll never forget one of the well-known New York Yankee players a few years ago. He was playing in this World Series too. I won't name him, but it was in the New York Times writ large. He had at that time been offered a $91 million contract by the Red Sox to leave the Yankee organization, come and play for the Red Sox. And he was trying to get the Yankees to up theirs, but they only went up to $89 million, not to $91 million. So he went out that day to talk to the owners and the manager and the negotiators. And when he walked into the house, and the New York newspapers quote, and I say this is exactly what they said in that paper. As she says, as I saw him walking in, by the expression on his face, I knew he'd been turned down. It was the saddest day in our lives that he was offered $89 million and not $91 million. Somewhere in his heart, he actually began to believe that that was a tragedy, that he was suffering immensely, and that his talent was worth a lot more than that. The political mind games we play when we want to believe something, and this is not to be taken as pro one party or another party, but I so remember sitting in front of the television utterly flabbergasted when former Governor Gray Davis was speaking to the press, utterly dismayed at the carryings on of Mr. Schwarzenegger in his private life. He said, this thing is unconscionable. What sort of things are these? At the same time announcing that the next day Mr. Clinton was going to come and speak on his behalf. And you say to yourself, just a minute, something is missing here. If it's wrong there, why was it not wrong in the other place also? If you don't believe what I'm saying to you, I have a hard time. Talk to a person who's betraying the trust of a marriage and got into something illicit. You will hear some of the most irrational rationalizations you'll ever want to hear in your life. All that is called in defense of a behavior, however driven, is not the point. Yes, the passions play a part. And we do not minimize the fact that in reality, lives do go wrong, lives do get broken, lives do get shattered. And thankfully, God is able to rebuild and put those lives back together. So I'm not speaking in any pejorative sense of the fact that these things, anytime they happen, are utterly unimaginable. That's not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is this, that the rationalization takes place because of the will to believe in a certain direction. And we will justify the most irrational. Not only do we find this breakdown because of the limited knowledge, and then we see it because of our propensity to believe. So I see the bridge of this thought leading me to my third one. But here's the verse I want to leave with you as I depart into the next context. It is what Jesus said to the people in his day. To what can I compare this generation? They're like children sitting in the marketplace and calling out to each other. We played the flute for you, but you did not dance. We sang a dirge for you, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved right by her action. What Jesus is really saying to them is, we couldn't win you over anyway. When John came, you found he had no laughter, you mocked him. When I came, you found I had no legalistic bone to what I was saying, and you mocked us. But you know, wisdom will live by what it knows to be true. You are like little children in a marketplace saying, we played the flute, you did not dance, we sang a dirge, you did not mourn. You are the ones who lack wisdom, because nothing we can do will satisfy what it is you want. Whatever we do, you want us to do the opposite. And that's what happens in the skeptic's mind. So that leads us to the third. It is not only the finitude, it is not only the propensity to believe, but it is this power of deception that we face. And the longer I am in the ministry, the more I have developed a healthy respect for the enemy of our souls. You know, when you're younger and you start out, you think you can carry on and wing it, and God's power is there, you can do it. And then you find out in a not so subtle way that the enemy of our souls will do everything possible to try to derail you. In the subtlest forms, using fatigue, using overwork, using success, using material blessings, using friendships. And I have seen this seduction take place so often now that it actually merits what C.S. Lewis said, it ought to be brought to your mind and mine. He said it so importantly. He said this: there are two extreme responses we have to the devil. Number one is to completely ignore him, and the other is to develop an unhealthy interest in him. But Lewis understood the machinations of this enemy of our souls very well. And I want to just take one point now to sustain how insightful he was in reminding us of the capacity to deceive that the devil has to deceive you and me. And he takes just one slender thought. I want you to follow me, because this may be hard to gauge, but you must follow me here. He says this in his book, The Screwtape Letters. He says the senior devil, Screwtape, writing to Wormwood, his nephew, to teach him how to seduce those who are getting closer to God and draw them away. He says this thing very carefully: work on their horror of the same old thing. The horror of the same old thing is the greatest passion we have put within the human heart, says the devil. Work on their horror of the same old thing. He says, you know, people get tired of the same old routine. And if you can use that, you can derail them. And you tell me when I've finished reading these two paragraphs if that's not precisely what has happened in our time. Writing now decades ago in Screwtape Letters, Lewis draws this imaginary conversation between Screwtape and Wormwood, first on how to work in the people in the church. Here's what he says to them. He says, substitute for faith. He says, substitute for faith something else. Because you have to get them to being beyond merely Christian. Make it Christianity and. Don't let them stop at being merely Christians. Christianity and culture, and new psychology, and faith healing. Substitute for the faith some fashion with a Christian coloring. Work on their horror of the same old thing. The horror of the same old thing is the greatest passion we have produced in the human heart. Examine where the church is today and tell me if that's precisely not what's happened. We are not content to be mere Christians anymore. We must be Christians and as you get into worship sometime, one sad book has been written recently by a retired minister. The church has passed me by. Think of men and women in their senior years, raised with music, with hymns. We're passing them by. We don't want to minister to them anymore because it's the same old thing. We can't be content with the richness and the grandeur of this age-old message. We want it to be Christianity plus. This is a dangerous seduction, and we have swallowed it, hook, line, and sinker. And I tell you what, it won't stay for the present either. It'll have to keep moving because we are being worked upon for the horror of the same old thing. Not the same old love, not the same old commitment, not the same old passion, not the same old integrity. Make it plus, make it plus, make it plus. And now listen to what he says about the world as Screwtape counsels Wormwood. Pick out the pleasure of eating and exaggerate it to the power of gluttony. They love change, so twist it into a demand for absolute novelty. What will actually happen then, Wormwood, is this. It will diminish pleasure while increasing desire. Did you hear that? It will diminish pleasure while increasing desire. Now, here's the clincher of a line. The greatest triumph we will have is to elevate the horror of the same old thing into a philosophy so that nonsense in the intellect may reinforce corruption of the will. You hear that? Nonsense in the intellect will reinforce corruption of the will. Have you ever heard such nonsense across the airwaves as we now do? All the things that laws want to change so that even when a society comes up and says we cannot justify late-term abortions, there are intellects out there who says we're going to fight this one too. The intellect has been corrupted. It has seized upon the will. And I say to you, Screwtape is doing his work in our society, both to the church and to the world. Isn't it unbelievable what happens when we think there is a gap, and that gap is real, we say. We forget our own finitude. We set aside our own propensities. We forget the enemy of our souls. Mind the gap. But there is a second thing that I want to tell you about, and that is the gap when the hopes are dashed with disappointments. So it's not just knowledge not in keeping with reality, but hopes become dashed with disappointments. I remember when I lost my dad. I lost my mom when she was 57, and lost my dad just 5 years after that. And the world never looks the same. You never stop needing your parents. You never stop needing your parents. But I remember one thing that happened which crushed us so much, and it's not meant to be critical. I think it's the way things go sometimes. There was somebody in our room who kept believing my dad wasn't going to die. He was on a respirator for several days. He wasn't going to die. Somehow he had this intimation, he said, that Dad wasn't going to die. Well, Dad did. We got the call. Once again, as it happened, I was the last one to speak to him before he was wheeled in for surgery. And all I say is, I remember my brothers, my sisters, all of us, and the sense of dismay we had. And most disappointed was the one who really thought he had the intimation that it was not going to be this way. Remember John the Baptist? When he was put in prison, he calls his disciples and says, well, why don't you go and talk to him? Is he really the one we are to be looking for? And the idea being, if he's the one we're looking for, what am I doing here? And Jesus says this, go back to him and tell him this, the blind receive their sight, the lame are walking, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. Blessed is the person who does not fall away from me, fall away on account of me. What he's really saying is, John, I can do the miracle. Do you not see that? Blind are seeing, dead are being raised, the deaf are hearing, leprosy is being cured, the lame are walking. The problem is not my inability to perform the miracle. John, don't stumble at me. When your desires are being dashed, when they're being shattered, and you say to yourself, why? Why did this happen? I remember when I was overseas and Nancy, who has worked all these years for me, knew exactly where I was. So I would need to hear this. And in one line across the miles, she just sent me the message that I should call Sammy Dagger, because a young man by the name of Radwan Dagger, Sammy's nephew, had suddenly died. I was stunned. I was in the Malaysian International Lounge when I read it. I said, this has to be a mistake. So I called at that hour. Yes, he'd passed away. And I say this to you without exaggeration. In 31 years of travel, if I were to take a sheet of paper and put down the names of some of the grandest Christians I met, Radwan would be somewhere near the top. We supported Radwan. This ministry gave him a scholarship. He came 2 years ago. And I remember his wife phoning me saying, I really don't want to see him go away from us and the children for so long. And our ministry recognized and understood that. We said, it's all right. We'll move the whole family. And one board member from the college who is here worked with us on that. So Radwan, Denise, their 2 children came. I remember going to Nyack and speaking, eating in their home. He was a prince of a guy, so humble, so gentle. And yet, Sammy was, I think, somewhere in Iraq or something, and or actually living in Lebanon, but in Iraq. And he phoned Radwan and he said, we've got to do something here, Radwan. We've got to do something here. Radwan says, Uncle Sammy, leave it with me. I'll have a strategic plan by the time you get back. 2-3 hours later, Sammy gets this phone call. Sammy told this to me with his own voice on the phone. He said, Brother Rafi, 2-3 hours later, I get this call. Radwan's been rushed to the hospital with some kind of a viral infection on the brain. He went unconscious. 7 days later, this 37-year-old young man was dead, leaving behind his young widow and 2 children, 10 and 7. Sammy and I have been friends for over 25 years. Nothing daunts Sammy. He cried on the phone and he told me, this is the loneliest moment in my life. For 17 years, I've poured my life into Radwan because I'm old now, I'm tired. He was to take over from me. He said, Ravi, it's my responsibility now to take care of a young widow and her 2 children. I cannot believe this has happened. Hopes are dashed. Suddenly, you faced it. You lived through it. This is not the way it was meant to be. There's a gap, isn't there? There's a gap. And we say, oh God, fill this gap. You see, in the first instance, when knowledge is not in keeping with reality, the gap comes down to the fact that we do not have the knowledge of God. But now, when it comes down to this struggle, what we need to bear in mind is that we do not always understand the purposes of God. We do not always understand the purposes of God. That great English writer F.W. Borum tells of the time a dear friend in his lost his wife. And he said every Sunday after church here in New Zealand in this little town of Mosgiel, he'd wind his way over to the cemetery and just sit there alone in front of her gravestone. And one day he came back and told this great essayist, he said, you know, Mr. Borum, he said, some days I go there, the sun is shining, the flowers are blooming, spring is in the air, it's beautiful. And I sit down and say to myself, my, this must be a bonny place for her to be. He said, other times I go in the coldness of the day, there's not a leaf. The cold is getting through into your bones. He says, and I have discovered something. The more wretched the weather is, the more I then think of her as she really is. She couldn't be in a place as desolate as that. I think of her as she really is. And ladies and gentlemen, what I say to you is, we don't have the knowledge of God. We don't always have the purposes of God. And thirdly, there's a gap when presence is suppressed by preoccupation. One of the grandest passages in New Testament writ is this. I don't know of anything so sweeping in apologetics as this statement from the Apostle Paul in Acts 17. Listen very carefully to what he says. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. Listen now, please. From one man he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. He did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from any one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. You see what he's saying? In the natural framework, our very being and our movement is because he pervades the very reality in which we walk. And he made all of us to dwell in a certain land by design. He raised you in America, and you are not far from him. He raised me in India. I was not far from him. In Africa, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in Cambodia, you find stories again and again and again of men and women lying alone in some places and crying out and finding out that God was nearer to them than they had ever realized. But his presence is suppressed by preoccupation. F.W. Borum says there are really 2 basic heresies that have come from long time ago, right from the beginning. The first is the heresy of there-ness. The second is the heresy of here-ness. Only Boram could think up such things. The heresy of there-ness, he says, comes from Adam. God is out there, but not here. So he hid from him. He's out there. I'm going to take of that fruit. He's out there. He's out there. I can do it. The heresy of there-ness, that God is there, but he's not here. The second is the heresy of Cain, the here-ness, but not there. God is here, but he's not there. So I'm going to go out from the presence of the Lord. You see, David found out a long time after that you can't do that. Remember what he said? As David sounded that warning to us, he said, where can I go from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, you are there. If I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me and your hand will hold me. David, as the friend of God, found that out. Nebuchadnezzar, as the enemy of God, found that out. He throws these 3 boys into the flames, and all of a sudden he says, just a minute, guys. Didn't we put 3 in there? I think there's 4. Like unto the Son of Man. So he says to them, why don't you boys come on out? If they really had a sense of humor, they'd have said, just a minute, guy, you put us in here, you come in and get us out. No. Those 3 found out that he was with them in the flames. My hand shall not hurt thee, I only design thy dross to consume and thy gold to refine. He is there, even right in the thick of it. Ernest Shackleton, who was that great explorer, always carried with him 2 things, the Bible and the words of abide with me. I need thy presence every passing hour. And he knew the words so well. And when he was buried in one of those exploratory expeditions, those were clutched by him, the Bible and the words of abide with me. When I was a teenager, my dad decided we needed to study the Bible. My dad didn't. We needed to. 2 people knocked on our door. They said they were Christian people. And they arrived, and they introduced themselves. We are witnesses of Jehovah, and we would like to talk to you about who Jehovah is. So they gave us their book, Let God Be True, and they gave us their magazines, The Watchtower and Awake, and we used to get together, the 5 of us, every week. I dreaded that moment, because I had to give up cricket in order to study this. But there they would come, still remember their names, and he would always begin by saying, 1 hour's a solid study will do for the day. I wanted to say 1 hour is 59 minutes too long. Let's get on with this. But you know, something began to happen. I began to believe what they were teaching me. They'd show me films of thousands of people gathering in Yankee Stadium to this group. They gave us gifts. They took us to meetings. I used to go to their meetings. I attended their meetings until one day they broke the news that only 144,000 were going to go to heaven. And I said, just a minute. Are you telling me after all this, I still don't know how I'm going to get there? And he said, well, that's what it says, isn't it? 12,000, 12 from every tribe and so on, and we got to keep working, we got to keep trying. I said, you know, sir, before you came, I didn't know where I was going. After you've come, I still don't know where I'm going. You can actually keep coming. You've lost me. I have no further interest. And you know, at that time, I felt so dejected. I really thought I had understood Christianity and rejected it. Little did I know, the voice of God was later on going to tell me, Ravi, I was there with you at that time, protecting you. I was there when you studied to keep your eyes open to the real truth. I remember when I was a youngster and India was at war with Pakistan, and I signed up for the Air Force and went to have the trials in the city of Dehradun, not far from Delhi. It was cold and wintry. I was very athletic, so I did very well in the athletic side of it. There were hundreds of them there, and I came in the top 3 when the results were posted. So I got the message back home, I'm going to make it because they're going to select about 10, and I'm on the top 3. Made it. Congratulations were in order and type of thing. Next day, I had the interview before I took the train, and I sat down in front of this Air Force officer, and he looked at me and he said, son, I want to tell you something. You have done very well, but I'm going to turn you down. I said, what? He said, I'm going to turn you down. I said, why, sir? He said, you are psychologically not equipped to kill. And this job will demand killing. I'm doing you a favor. I got into the train and I was horrified. When I arrived in Delhi, my family and friends were all waiting at the platform with garlands to congratulate me. And I got off that train to tell them I've been turned down. He was there. Because had I signed up with the armed forces, I would never have been able to get out the country when I did. I'd never have done the studies that I ended up doing. A week before we were to leave Canada, emigrating in 1966, we were to go to Calgary. That's where we were bound. And one of our friends said, why are you going to Calgary? I said, well, I got a friend there, had a hand in leading me to the Lord. They said, we're going to Toronto. Why don't you come to Toronto? Oh, okay, we'll go to Toronto. So my older brother and I changed everything. We're going to Toronto. If I'd not come to Toronto, I wouldn't have met her. Need I say any more? For this calling has demanded a greater commitment from my spouse than it has demanded from me. And that's where I met Margie, the very first time we were in church together. She was 16, I was 20. And God began to put the links together. Had I not been there, I wouldn't have gone to the institutions I did, been trained the way I was. And what God was saying to me is, I was there. When I attempted to commit suicide and was hours away from death, body strapped up into this IV to keep the fluids going, and I nearly succeeded. Thank God I didn't. He was there. You see, His presence is nearer to you than you can ever imagine. From the very womb He laid you in, to the ethnicity that He gave to you, He says, I am not far from you. Boram says one of the most precious memories of his childhood days was when his mother was reading a story to them. Every Sunday night, she would keep one or two of the children, the others would go. And one day he said to her, Mom, tell me one of your favorite moments as a younger person. She said, I'll tell you. One day I was to meet one of my closest friends, Kitty. We were going to meet at Canterbury Cathedral. And I went there and I sat down. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited, and Kitty never came. And I saw a man in his 50s, very distinguished looking, showing another man through that grand cathedral. And he saw me fidgeting and looking at my watch. And after that other man went away, he said, Miss, are you worried about something? She said, yes. I was to meet a friend here. It's not like her not to come. He said, well, maybe she's late, or the train was, whatever it is, just something is delayed. She's not going to make it, or something to that effect. He said to her, can I show you around? And she was nervous. She said, it was brilliant. He talked to me of the coming of Augustine to Canterbury. He showed me the shrine of Thomas à Becket, the sacking by the Danes. Then Boram puts it in these words, the medley of architecture furnished him with a sheaf of thrilling romances. Don't you like that? The medley of architecture, you see words? The medley of architecture provided him with a sheaf of thrilling romances. Finally, he gave the woman his card and said, if I can ever be of any help to you, don't hesitate to contact me. He asked her for her card. She said, I don't have one. So she put his card into the purse and went home. Later that night, she said, he was such a special man. She pulls the business card out, Charles Dickens. She had Canterbury Cathedral explained to her by Charles Dickens, and she didn't know it. Did not her heart burn within her? I told this story once. I was in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Margie and I must make her ashamed of me many times. She's a student. She studies every little thing. I do most things in a hurry, so we can get it over with and get back. She'd study the painting, she'd study the wood, she'd study the everything. And we walked through and left and came out. It's very good. Lovely place. Some years later, I was reading Henry Nouwen's Change in Life when he was a professor at Harvard and gave it up to go and work with retarded children in Toronto. And you know how it happened? He was at the Hermitage Museum and he saw the Rembrandt depiction of the prodigal son coming home. And he sat in front of that painting for 3 hours and it changed his life. I didn't even know the painting was in there because I went through that. As Tozer said, skipping through the corridors of the kingdom, looking at everything, pausing to learn the true value of nothing. I remind you how easy it is. And I wrote this prayer one day as I was thinking of the fact that God moves so differently, doesn't he? With Peter, he took him half the way with the angel and then let him go the other half. With Abraham, he only came through at the last minute. With Jesus, he didn't even intervene at that moment when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? So I wrote this prayer down. Your ways mystify me, O Lord. Oh yes, in some journeys I feel you all the way, never doubted. But sometimes you seem to vanish after halfway of that journey. At other times, you appear to me in the very last moment. And you know, Lord, sometimes I actually fear that you will let me go over the edge. You are very unique, my child, and I will help you learn of me with that uniqueness in mind. You see, if I took everybody all the way, Ravi, where is the room for their faith? If I took everybody more than half the way, where is the room for their love? If I did not let you at times even feel abandoned, where is the room for my cross? You are not what you will someday be. I am who I am. And I know how to get you from who you are to who I am. If you do not understand this, where is your hope? The day will come, from strength to strength, from glory to glory. Sometimes you'll sense him halfway through a tragedy. At other times, he'll come through in the last moment. Some days you might say, Lord, you've let me go over the edge. And he says to you, will you please understand not just my purposes, but my methods? We need his knowledge. We need to understand his purposes. We need to understand his methods. And this brings me to the final thought. When simplicity breaks into sublimity. Every one of my colleagues will tell you this. As wonderful as all this apologetic sounds, at the end of the day, it's not what satisfies the heart. At the end of the day, you put your head down on the pillow, and it is the touch of a hand. It is a voice on a phone. It is a little gift from somebody. It is a little note. It is a simple little thing that says to you, I love you, and you mean an awful lot to me. That's the simplicity combined with sublimity. And our precious Lord didn't take them to something sophisticated, but to something they'd seen him do many times. Break a piece of bread. And they said, that's him. Unless you become as little children and allow the blending of the simple with the sublime, you too will miss who's walking next to you all the way, and your eyes will only realize it after he has left you and gone on to some other spot. That simplicity and sublimity bridges the gap. I'm almost through. Give me your undivided attention. Let me, like a funnel now, bring this down to the end. You see, Jesus did not break the bread at the beginning. He gave them a lesson in history first. He did the work of an apologist. He said, you don't you remember what Moses said? Don't you remember what Abraham said? Don't you remember what David said? Do you remember what Job said? Do you remember what Elijah? Do boys not remember any of this? Connected. And their hearts were just rising to the top. He was bridging the gaps. They knew so much, but they'd forgotten what it all meant. And he brings the bridge. He brings the coherence. He binds the soul to the body when he takes a piece of bread and eats it, just like he took a piece of fish and ate it with the rest of them, resurrecting the reality that the physicality is important, the spiritual is important, and only he knows how to bring the two together. And it was culminated in a simple little act. Some of you may not remember the name of Harvey Milcon, who gave his testimony years ago. Harvey has passed away, a tough man. Raised, I think, in New York, hard, coarse type of individual, by his own admission. Big guy, wealthy, argued skeptics into the ground. He was about to take a long vacation with his wife, and his little granddaughter sat on his knee and put her arms around him and said, "Grandpa, I'm worried." He said, "Why?" "I'm worried that I may not see you in heaven. If something happens to you on this trip, Grandpa, I will never see you in heaven again." And this big guy with his little girl on his knee found that heart beginning to beat at a faster rate till the tears ran down. And with his granddaughter's help on his knee, Harvey Milcon gave his life to Jesus Christ. Simplicity and sublimity had conquered that dulled heart, so hard of hearing. It'll happen. It'll happen time and time again. W.E. Sangster tells of the missionary who lived in Leeds, was preaching in Plymouth, and wanted to call home at night. And in the old days of trunk calls, you had to wind the telephone call through various spots of the country. And unknown to him, an operator was listening at that point, waiting for the next link to pick up, and the evangelist at the end of a tired day muttered the words of a song. "My knowledge of that life is small, the eye of faith is dim, but 'tis enough that Christ knows all, and I shall be with him. My knowledge of that life is small, the eye of faith is dim, but 'tis enough that Christ knows all, and I shall be with him." That could have been written by the two men on the Emmaus Road, and they made a long-distance call too. They walked all the way to Jerusalem to tell the people, you got to listen to this. I close with this simple application. People will try to put life back together in many ways. Pleasure, power, knowledge, many things, religion. Nobody can put it together like Jesus Christ because he's the truth. Here's what I say to you in closing. Naturalism settles for the theory of chaos. Jesus offers coherence. Islam talks of Allah, the compassionate, but it is Jesus who went to the cross. You see, compassion literally means to suffer with. There's no place like the cross. So Islam talks of Allah the compassionate, but it is Jesus who went to the cross. Hinduism talks of karma and the debt of morality. It is Jesus who offers forgiveness and paid the price of sin. Buddhism talks of the eradication of desire. Jesus offers to fill those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. That is why we sing of his offer. I will pour water on him who is thirsty. I will pour floods upon the dry ground. Open your heart for the gift I am bringing. While you are seeking me, I shall be found. The gap is not in him. It is in us. Mind the gap. Because simplicity and sublimity will bridge it when knowledge doesn't seem to coalesce with reality, when hopes are dashed by disappointment. And finally, as you come to the recognition that your busyness can dull his presence, he is the God of the gaps, in distinction to the others who create the gaps. The problem is not in him, it is in us. Please pray with me. Father, How wonderful to know that you are the God who bridges the gaps. Thank you for the reminder tonight of the wonderful way you cause good things to grow. The reminder that we can see when you open our eyes. Lord, forgive me for the times I have failed you and thought you were not there when you were very much there. Forgive us for thinking we know so much when we really know so little. Oh God, our help in ages past, you are our hope for years to come. Help us, Lord, to mind the gaps and to know that only you can fill those gaps, that you are here and you are there and you will always be with us. Thank you for the appointment we have with you here tonight. In our precious Redeemer's name. Amen.